So we are going to pick back up on the desk or room assignment. So the first thing that I'm going to do is save this as a second version, because each time I like to start on a project, I like to incrementally save, so that way I always have a version that I can go back to in case something bad happens. So I'm going to save out a version 2 right now, and I'm in file open, whoopsie. So save as. Alright, so now I can proceed and keep saving up to date without anything to worry about. So the last we left off, we made a desk and we have kind of a basic floor. It might not be a bad idea to add some walls to our room or to get started on the chair. I think both of those are valid options. So probably the easier thing to do for the time being is to make the walls. So let's get going on that. So you'll see here that I have this plane. This is what we intended to be our floor. Again, this is just a plain primitive object. But we can see that it has a number of segments. And again, my black lines, which display all of my polygons, are visible because I have my display mode right here above the viewport set to the line mode, which is the second one in the list. So if you don't see the lines, you can try and change that, but it's not necessarily important to see. It's just it's a good demonstration for you guys to start getting comfortable with. We might remember from yesterday, or the last class I should say, sorry, when we were starting to select different edges or different polygons of an object. It's usually easier to do that sort of thing when there's less polygons to have to worry about. What I mean by that is we can take our floor and we can extrude upwards to create the walls and the ceiling of our room. So let's try that. So we hit C, and we can see if we want to select all of the edges, it's going to be kind of annoying. Like, we could just kind of mouse and drag and do all this, hold Control to get rid of those, hold Shift to add on to these, and then hold Control to get rid of those. So that's kind of annoying. There was one tool that we went over, and it was one of the selection tools that is under the U quick menu, and that was Loop Select. So U and then L. So we could try to select this and maybe select the borders. By default, it doesn't really want to make it too easy to do that. There happens to be a option in the attributes for this tool to select boundary loop. Boundary is obviously the outside edges, hence the word boundary. So if we enable that, we can highlight all of these edges around here, and then we can extrude upwards. So we could do all of that, but if I undo a handful of steps, we can actually make this easier on ourselves if I back up to the point before I made my floor editable. Now, because this is back to being a primitive object, or a parametric object, as sometimes it's also called, we have these attributes. And we can see width and height segments are set to 20. If I were to change these to 1 and 1 respectively, we see that it gets rid of all of those intermediary lines. In the case of this being a floor, a nice simple box that's flat and it has 4 sides, and then a ceiling, this is a little bit more manageable in my opinion, because now we have a whole lot fewer edges that we need to select. Let's just say if we want to extrude upwards to make our room. Now, one thing I do want to suggest is, because we are going to be working with cameras and stuff, we're still just kind of getting used to the program, I would recommend that we actually only make 3 walls to our room. If you think of like a sitcom TV show or a set, where obviously one side of the wall isn't built, so that way the camera can look in. It just makes it a little bit easier for us to, quote, film, you know, air quotes, you know, setting up a camera and maybe animating our camera moving around our room to not have to deal with having a wall in here. Because if I extrude upwards, oops, actually I can just do it and then I can demonstrate to you guys why it is kind of annoying. So I'm using my Extrude tool. Again, that was the hotkey D to extrude out these walls, but we'll see that they went out flat along the floor, not perpendicular to the floor. And that is because, again, there's an option here in the attributes of this tool that we want to configure, and that is this edge angle attribute. Currently it is set to 0, so that means it's following along the direction that these edges were on. But if we input 90, we can see that it will make that extrusion go upwards vertically to create walls, how we would imagine walls to be. Now we can demonstrate what I'm talking about, trying to move around in here. But like if you move or if you zoom out, you might, you know, collide with the walls. It's just kind of annoying. So I would say at the end of the day, whether you extruded all of the walls or just 3 of them at a time, we can go ahead and just delete the front, more or less. So this way we only have a 3-sided room, and it's a little bit easier for us to navigate and position ourselves in. So that is all of that. Now we might want to add a ceiling. You could get fancy and make it a sloped ceiling if you wanted to, but I'm just going to make mine flat across, and there are a handful of ways that we can do that. Probably the most straightforward one is using another new tool called the Bridge tool. So the Bridge tool, in my opinion, works a little bit better if we are in edge selection mode. So I'm going to select the 2 opposing walls, and if you think of what a bridge does, a bridge can horizontally connect 2 points. So we can get to the Bridge tool in our modeling quick menu, M, and then B for bridge. And if we click from one edge, we can see, it might be tough to see up on the projector, but if you're doing this yourself, you'll be able to see that this line highlighted white, and then if I move my mouse over to the opposing wall, we see this white preview line, which is illustrating the polygon that is going to make for us, and then we just let go of the mouse, and voila. Cool, we've got a ceiling, and a floor, and 3 walls. So we can go and apply some basic materials to these. Might not be a bad idea to maybe get a material from Google, such as maybe like a tiled floor or a carpet of some kind. It's up to you for the floor. So I am going to go ahead and do that. So we're going to jump to our trusty friend Google, and we're going to look up, I'm going to do a tile texture. This is going to be kind of a weird room with a tile floor and a desk, but whatever. So any of these would work, but I am going to sort so that I can get maybe a little bit larger of an image. That's not too bad. And this gives us a good opportunity to learn about a new portion of texturing. So we can go ahead and save out this image. Oops, save, not copy. So again, I want to make sure that I save this to my folder where my project is, and I want to save it into the text folder. So we're going to call this tile, if I can spell. Alright, so we'll make a new material, floor, tile. So in this material, we can now input our texture. Tile floor. Awesome. So it is input into our color, but it's important to think a tile floor in between where the tiles are laid, the seams, or the grout. I was going to say the molding in between tiles is going to be a little bit lower than the surface of the tiles. If that's not exactly clear, we can look at the brick wall that is beside us. The little area in between each block is set inwards ever so slightly. And we can replicate that same effect in 3D in a number of ways, but for the time being, the option that we are going to use is called the bump channel, or a bump map. So we can check on the bump map, and nothing's going to happen by default. And the reason for that is because we need to input our texture into the bump channel as well. This works particularly well in my case because this image is black and white. And the bump channel is going to be read in a way that a black portion of the image is going to bump downwards and a white portion of the image is going to bump upwards. So we can input our tile floor texture. And again, we're not going to see a whole lot going on in the little preview window here. But we can go ahead and apply this material onto our floor. So I've got my floor polygon selected, and I can apply the floor directly to this polygon. Sorry, I can apply the floor material to that polygon, and we can verify that we have the material tag and its corresponding polygon selection tag. So that's all cool. And we see, well, something. Tiles look a little big, in my opinion, but we can kind of get close, try to zoom in, and see if we render. It doesn't quite look too strong. So I can go over to the attributes of the bump channel. By default, it's set to 20%, just whatever the program decides to set it to. So I can try 100%. And we can see that that looks a little bit more pronounced, although it's going a little bit too far now because the fact that this was a compressed image that we got off of the internet, in other words, it is a relatively low quality JPEG image, we can start to see some of that artifacting representing itself in the floor. If we get really close, we can see the pixels, which is kind of wild. So I'm going to lower that maybe down to 50%. So it's still kind of present, but we're able to see the seams. And you might be wondering, how are we going to make these tiles smaller? Well, obviously you could go in Photoshop and scale this image down, but there are much better ways to do that. And in fact, there's a really easy way built right into Cinema. So if we select the texture tag, there are some options which we haven't really used up to this point. In the attributes panel for this texture tag, we see a handful of settings: offset U, length U, tiles U, offset V, length V, tile V. So some of these are relatively self-explanatory, maybe. At least you might have an idea of what these might do. But the U and the V might be kind of weird. So in 3D, we have the three axes, X, Y, and Z. But there are also other axes that are important for us. And in this case, when you're working in a 3D program and they need to, the software needs to reference something that is two-dimensional, in this case an image file, we usually use the letters U and V. Now U is the horizontal axis and V is the vertical axis. So basically what these are saying is offset U would be this way and offset V would be this way. So if I was to raise or slide that offset value in the U direction, we can see that this texture will slide left and right. Now that's not necessarily what we want to do. We actually want to change the tiles value. So if I raise this to say 2, we'll see that this texture gets repeated twice as often, or it is shrunken in half, depending on how you want to think of it. But in this case, I probably want these two numbers to be the same. These are square tiles, not necessarily rectangular tiles. So I can adjust this value to taste. I think maybe 3 by 3 might be pretty good, just depending on kind of the scale of my room. So if we kind of get into place here and we render, we can see that looks like a tile floor. Not too bad. So we've got our floor. It might not be a bad idea to get some sort of material applied to our walls now. So I can just go ahead and make a new material. And you could go ahead and have fun and find some sort of wallpaper, or if you're really crafty, you could make your own texture as a wallpaper. I'm just going to pick a sort of generic, maybe sort of somewhere in the vaguely blue color family. I'm not an interior decorator at all, but that looks like something. And then for the ceiling, we'll just do like a darker version of that. And we can verify, as I've been applying these materials to the polygons, each material tag has a corresponding polygon selection. I don't have any unnecessary or overlapping or interfering textures, so I think I'm happy with that. I can move on to the task of making a chair. So let's look up chairs. So you could look up office chair, and some of these are going to be pretty complicated, especially something like this. That would be quite a task to try to replicate all of these puffy different pads and cushions and all that. Something like this, although maybe weird looking, is a little bit more manageable. It's a little bit more simple of a shape. We can look at this and start to piece together in our heads maybe what primitive objects we could start with, maybe a sphere or a cylinder, for example, to make the rounded portion of this, and then maybe start with a cube to make the seat. Just start to think about stuff like that, but I don't want necessarily a stool chair. I don't want a baby high chair, but I want like maybe like a bar stool of some sort, but I want something with a back. So this is kind of in the ballpark of what I was thinking, just because I want to model something a little bit differently. I know I've done a handful of them over the handful of semesters that we've been doing this, so like I said with the desk, feel free to skip through some of the other semester's videos to see if there's a desk, or sorry, a chair that jumps out to you that you really like. This is kind of an interesting look. I don't know necessarily what material I want it to be made out of, but alright, well, we're not going to do that one. Alright, this looks simple enough. I think I'm going to go with this. And if I have to maybe adjust the proportioning of my desk to make this sort of chair make sense, that's no biggie. We can certainly make that happen. So I am going to save this into my reference folder, chair reference 1. So this is like the desk made of a handful of pieces. We can see each leg would be individual. The foot rest bar, whatever, would be an individual piece. This section here that conjoins each pair of legs and then the seat as well. So again, thinking of vaguely how these things are built out is going to be pretty useful. So that way we can tackle these kind of one piece at a time and make ourselves, or make our lives, a little bit easier. So I can go and open up that image. This way I can jump back to it and zoom in and zoom out, do my thing.
Is that picture a 3D model? Or?
That's a great question. In case the microphone didn't hear, the question was, is this image what I'm looking at a 3D render? And it's very likely. In the third assignment, we'll go over product rendering, actually, and in that assignment we will start to learn together as a class that a lot of what you look at is not a photograph anymore. Yeah, things like product images on websites, or even just in advertisements, you know, on commercials on TV. Not as much of that is real as you might realize. But anyway, that's for a few more weeks, that discussion. So we will just get started on this leg. These are relatively tall, so we can start with a cube and obviously make that a whole bunch more skinny in the X and Z axes. Probably shorten it in Y a bit.
Is there a way to shorten just one side at a time rather than having it be like simultaneous?
Yeah, so once we get to, well, right now, so the question is like, how can you scale either individual axes or certain axes one at a time? Because this object is still a primitive, it wants us to use the orange handles to adjust these, but once we make this editable, we can do exactly that, where we can either lock or constrain certain axes one at a time. But for the time being, I am going to enter in, I don't know, I'm just kind of guessing, but I would imagine at the bottom here, this would maybe be 1.5 inches, 1.25 inches or so. Just kind of guessing. So I'm going to type in like 1.5 inches, so 1.5 IN, and that will do the math for me for the X and the Z axes. Again, I'm not grading this on, you know, engineering levels of accuracy, but just so that I can kind of maybe start to get the proportioning right, I'm just going to give that a shot. And I can think a seat like this would be tall enough for you to sit in sort of directly, not necessarily to have to like bend down to sit in. And I happen to be, I don't know, like 5'8", so I would think my waistline would be somewhere around, I don't know, probably 30, somewhere between 30 and 40 inches. So we can just try 35 inches. Might be a little bit tall, but whatever. We can always make more adjustments later. So I can make that editable and name it chair leg. And we're going to need 4 of these. So the cool thing about starting with this is once we do one of them, we can pretty easily duplicate it into all 4. So we will probably want to scale up the top of this because these legs taper down a bit. What I mean by that is they are taller, or sorry, they are wider along their tops than they are along at the bottom. So if we select this top polygon, and if I get really invested in this, I will notice that it is longer in one axis than the other. So this direction is longer than this direction, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to pick the blue axis, in this case Z, so that is the direction going this way, and that's the direction that I'm going to scale this in. So the question earlier of like how can we scale scale in different axes one at a time, that is going to be pretty straightforward. once we see this. So up to this point, we've probably been using the scale tool just by clicking and dragging using the T key, and that scales all the axes at once. But what if we want to scale it only in one direction? Well, if we mouse over the direction that we want to scale it in, that axis will turn white, and that will allow us to scale in one axis or the other. Now, there are also these corner handles, and if we highlight over these, we will see that they highlight 2 axes at a time. So you've got a number of options, although it is relatively, it's not clearly described, but if you don't click any axis and you use the scale tool, it will scale all 3. If you use one of the corner axes, you scale 2 at a time. And if you highlight only one of them at a time, well, you're only using 1 at a time. So I'm going to scale this direction up just a little bit so that we can get that to be a little bit larger in one direction than the other. And we can get back going. So another important aspect of this chair is the fact that these edges slant. And so I can just pull this in one direction to make it slant the way that I need it to. And if you were to get a side image, let me just see if I can find one on its side. Well, this isn't exactly it, but we can see that the point over here, the rightmost point of this side and the rightmost point of this side, we can start to kind of eyeball that this needs to come down. And it might even be far enough that, this side of it overlaps that side. So I'm just going to kind of use that as my baseline to figure out how much to move this. Just because I want it to look relatively, proper. So that will be the first leg. And again, we might make more changes to this. We might be applying, we will be applying materials and stuff to this. So I don't want to necessarily copy and paste. I want to use instancing. And again, the instance is a live copy that once we make it, if we edit the original sort of source object, those changes will be reflected in each of the instanced copies. So we can get to the instance object again under the green array menu, and then instance right here. So we can call this chair leg 2, and we can drag it sort of about the width of the chair over. And again, the proportioning of this might not be completely spot on, but that's all right. Once we get the whole thing made, we can group it and scale it up or down, or we can take the desk and scale it up or down, so that way they look cohesive next to one another. So we can go ahead and copy and paste this. Now, what might not be too bad of an idea, because I'm lazy, and this is sort of a trick that I've sort of picked up after doing this a whole heck of a lot of times, is you might be tempted to just keep copying this and moving them around, but I want them to be actually accurately placed with one another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate these, or actually I can just demonstrate to you guys. So when we copy and paste, we can hit Control C, Control V, or if you use either the move or rotate tool, you can do a movement and copy at the same time by holding Control. So what I mean by that is if I want to pull these in this direction, if I hold Control and pull them in that direction, I'm also making copies. So I can make the other legs and then rotate these. And again, once I start rotating, I can hold Shift to rotate them 180 degrees, and we can see that I'm going to need to space these out a bit more to match the width that we need. But you'll probably recognize that now one of these is no longer an instance. So that's not cool. What I can just do is I can make an instance, and this is going to get kind of messy, but we'll clean up this. We can see that this attribute, chair leg 1.1, well, that's like this one that we kind of don't want, whereas chair leg 1 was our original. So if I just take that, if I select this weird messed up one, and I can just replace what object it's referencing, I should be able to delete that without any issue. So I can go ahead and rename all these. If you get lost in any step of that, don't worry. It's no big deal if you just go ahead and copy and paste them sort of in a row. That's all fine. So with all of those selected, I'm going to group them. Again, that is Alt-G to group. So I'm going to call these legs group. Because I'm going to have a handful of other objects, we can worry about putting those all in and naming all those in a moment. So probably the easiest thing to add in is those little foot rests. So we can make those out of cubes. Just kind of get that. I don't necessarily want it sticking out of either side because that is a circular, maybe a dowel or some sort of cap. It's not a square shape. So that should be fine. And I don't know if these are angled. It's hard to tell. This image isn't. Oh, no, they are angled. I think so. Whatever, we'll angle them. Cool. So we can go ahead and make a copy. Now, at this point, I want to demonstrate the axis that some of these objects are on. Because I have something that I've rotated a sort of non-normal sort of degree, there's something that we want to be careful. I could go ahead and do the trick where we control drag to copy and paste this, but we see that this one is going on a slanted angle, right? It's not going perfectly up, down, left, or right. It's going at an angle, and that is because we've rotated that object, and its axis point is no longer, perfectly in line with the origin, kind of the project. So there is a button to switch between those, and it is the W key. And if we see right here, this axis button right here either turns on or off, and when it's enabled we see sort of a little globe looking guy, or maybe a basketball, but to me it looks like a globe, and another word for globe is world. World starts with the letter W. W, world. It's an easy hotkey for me to remember. But again, we can always just mouse over that and it says we can switch between the world or object coordinate system. So now we can just drag that and rotate this again 180 degrees, and that way we have it matching the same direction. So I can put those into the group with the legs, and we can go ahead and make the section that needs to stick up now, probably. So when I make this, I'm actually going to do a slightly different command. Again, another opportunity to learn another trick here. With this legs group selected, I want to make a cube automatically part of this group, right? Because we can see when I make this cube, it's not going into the hierarchy here that we had selected, the group. So if we have that selected, and when we hold Shift when we make the cube, we can see that it makes it part of that. Now that is a small time saver, but if I switch to its coordinate, I can zero all of these out, and now if I scale this, it will be perfectly centered to the cube, or to the group. So this way I can start to make my seat, or actually, no, we were making the portion on the side. So we will elongate that a bit like so. Bring that over a bit. In doing that trick where we held shift and zeroed out its position allows us to make it and then get it in position a little bit quicker. So I don't know what to call this portion of the desk. So I'm just going to call it, I don't know, brace, because it connects to other pieces. So we can make this editable, and we know as when we were modeling the legs of the desk, to get this round section, we're going to be looking to utilize the bevel tool. So before we get there, we need some extra geometry to work with. So if we go to edge mode, we can make some cuts using our knife tool. Okay. And in this case, I do want to use the loop knife, so that's L. So we can click once and then click twice just to get these two cuts sort of in the right spot.
Is there any way you can like make it so it's mirrored, so both it does it on both sides, so you don't?
You could, yeah. So the question was, is there a way to make this cut like perfectly even on both sides? And we could do that. So if we hold K and then L and get back to our tool here, just like how we can hold shift when we're moving something and it will snap. If we hold shift with the knife tool, we can see that it will constrain in certain axes, but that's not exactly the most important part that we wanted. If we make our first cut, we will see along the bar here up on the interface there are some buttons next door, a plus and a minus, and these will insert more cuts simultaneously. So if you really wanted to, what you could do is you can slide each of these cuts sort of one by one, and we can see that, okay, this cut looks close enough to 80%. So I can round or hit enter and type in 80. And then that means on the other side over here, I'm going to want to go to 20%. So if you care to get this accurate, you can go ahead and do those. I might try 19 and 81. Just to get those a little bit closer. But again, not the most important thing. It's just if you want to. So anyway, with those two outer portions selected, we can extrude downwards. Because we remember when we were doing the section of the desk, we need an edge right there for us to bevel. So these are kind of sticking out a bit, and I think as of right now I should be able to use the scale tool to kind of nudge those out a little bit. And again, this doesn't need to be super close because I'm actually going to wind up deleting portions of this. This is somewhat of a complicated shape, but it's going to allow us an opportunity to learn that we can do a handful of commands, get a result that we want in one section, and then maybe delete the other junk that we don't want. Because we can see this leg extends up past. If we pay attention to the wood grain, we can see that this, whatever this section is called, it really stops like right here. We don't need any of this stuff over here. Really all we're looking to do is get a bevel right there and a bevel right there. So we'll select those two edges and we will grab our bevel tool, and I can go ahead and do that operation, and that's looking pretty good. Looks like maybe this is a little bit more flat and not quite as round. There actually happens to be a option for that. It is this parameter or slider right here called depth. Again, you don't really need to be this thorough, but if you want to, then awesome. So now I can just go ahead and delete all of these pieces that I don't need. Pretty much the whole outside section of this. So a second ago I said, you know, we can do commands and get a result that we want in one area and ignore the other parts. That's totally a valid option or a valid approach. So I can select those 2 points. Now, when you're seeing me with the selection tool, I'm going to kind of click and drag over that point right there. And I know, I don't have X-ray vision, but I know, I've done this enough times to be able to kind of guesstimate that there's going to be a point right around the back there. And I have it selected. So I can save myself a little bit of time. Yeah, we can actually see it kind of peeking in there. We can grab both of those. And I'm just going to scale these ever so slightly. Oh, that's fun. Okay, we're going to run into our first unexpected. Oh, that's weird. There's like extra points there. Whoa, what do we do? Well, we have a whole number of tools to fix that. But probably the easiest one is maybe a tool I didn't expect to show quite so early in the class, but that's all right. It is the Polygon Pen Tool. You could also use the Weld tool, which is the hotkey Q, but I'm going to use the Polygon Pen. And it's pretty easy to use. All we have to do is click and drag that one over there, and it will move the point that we first select and move it over to the point that we are releasing on. So it's kind of just a way to move and snap these points, and then that way I don't have a gap in between. So that's pretty good. I think I'm going to be happy with that so far.
So are those points merged together now, or do you move it?
They are merged together, not with the leg, but they're merged together with, you know, there used to be 2 points there, but right now there's only one. So if I was to select this point, we can see that there is only 1 point there. There is no ghost kind of point hanging out underneath it. But I'm going to either need to lower this polygon or raise up the legs. And I think I've got the height of this segment correct, so I'm going to raise the leg. And again, because of our friend the instance, when I move one of these, it's going to move all of them, which is cool. But it looks like I've got to kind of move those over again. So you don't have to care quite so much if you don't want to, but I do. So we'll just kind of get that close right there. And instead of moving these, I'm actually using the scale tool, if that wasn't quite clear. Just because it is easy to do 2 things. We're basically spreading them apart. So I'm going to call that good for that piece. And we will use the instance again to make a copy of it. And this one's symmetrical, kind of, you know, from this side to that side. So we don't need to do any weird, you know, rotating it around and doing all kinds of weirdness. I just want to get it so that it is relatively flush. That's fine. So the edges look like they're overlapping in edge mode, but when we go back to the normal mode, can't really see anything, so you can get away with it. Cool. And it looks like there's a little bit of an overhang on the inside here, but chances are once we put the seat over this, we're not going to see those. So for now, I'm not going to pay much attention to those. I can come back to them if I need to. So let's make the seat. So, does anyone want to guess how we're going to do this curve? We could do the plane. Yeah, a plane would not be a bad place to start, maybe for this flat section. So let's give that a shot. Trying to make a plane. Oops, and I should have held down Shift when I made that, because I want to make sure that this is perfectly centered. So I can scale this down. So one section of it is going to need to kind of overhang downwards, and another section of it is going to need to overhang or go upwards. So one side will go down, one side will go up. And to get some of these curves, we can use the bevel tool. But first we have to extrude to kind of get sort of a, again, I'm going to use snipping tool to demonstrate what I mean. We're going to want to make a shape that looks like this. Obviously the perspective's not drawn excellently, but just a right angle or a pair of right angles. So call this seat and check its attributes, because again, if we turn our display mode on, this is maybe a few more edges than we want for the time being. So we'll lower those down to 1 by 1, make that editable. You guys can see where probably the rest of this is going. So I'm going to nudge that in and use the Extrude Tool. Now, I could use the Extrude Tool, or I can do similar to how when I had an entire object selected and I held Control and moved it to duplicate an object, we can use Control to more, at least in my opinion, more quickly and more efficiently use the Extrude Tool. So if we hold Control and drag this downwards, we'll see that we make that section that goes down for your leg, or kind of the rear of your thigh or so. And in this section, we can have this come up, and this will be the back of the seat. Again, just by holding Control. And we can start to bevel this. So I'm just kind of eyeballing it, so it's going to be tough to get the proportions exact. Oops. Oh, so okay, easy mistake to make. I did one extrusion, but I'm not really happy with this. My options are I can undo and attempt it again, or I can click and hold on the currently highlighted yellow section, and nope, I lied. So I think it's because I Alt-tabbed. So again, I could draw this extrusion, and this is kind of like how far I want to go. But let's say I messed it up, so I can undo. Or if I'm still in the active tool, I should be able to continue to drag it. It can be a little bit finicky, so if it doesn't work, my advice would be to undo and just attempt it again, because you really would not want to do this and have like a whole heck of a lot of edges, because this is going to cause you issues. So this is more the look that I'm looking for. And we can see that these are starting to peek through ever so slightly. So we can fix that by going to the chair leg. And if I add a cut, I want to add a cut up here where it's sort of normal. And then this edge, I can just kind of move that guy down and just get him out of the way. Because most likely we're not going to be looking up into the seat. I can just kind of get away with a little something there. So that's cool. So I don't think the proportioning of this is all too hot. I think I've got some more work to do, but I will let you guys take a break. We've been going for a good minute, so I'm going to touch this up a little bit. We will meet back up, let's just say at 5 after, so 6:05, and we'll pick back up on the lecture. So our recording is back on track. We're done with our break. So I just slightly adjusted the proportions of my desk. I made things a little bit wider, because I know this is sort of at a 3/4 perspective. It's kind of tricky to get the width and stuff exactly right, but I think I'm a little bit closer now than I was before the break. So I'm just going to nudge that back out a little bit. Actually, I remember I moved these in specific increments, so I can subtract 5 on that side and plus 5 on this side. And I'm just using the number pad on my keyboard to input those. Sometimes using specific increments is nice, because then you've got easy changes to replicate. But anyway, we can go ahead and make the round section for your bottom on the chair. So how can we do that? Well, the first things first is we're going to need to add a cut going this way along our seat, because not quite using the bevel tool, but you know how we added some roundness on these corners, we're going to kind of attempt something similar, but the first thing that we need is to add some edges. So I'm going to make my first cut, and I'm going to just click up that plus sign a couple notches so that way I've got a handful of these edges to work with. So there are two things going on here. The rear of the seat is actually rounded a bit. If we go to our trusty snipping tool, where I can start to illustrate, this is ever so slightly curved. And then there's also a bit of curvature here. So these are my super sweet drawing with a mouse skills on display. But these are going to illustrate the fact that there are two directions that we're going to need to start moving some of these polygons in. The first one is easy to tackle. So we can go ahead and use our point selection mode, and we can select all of these points here in the middle. So I'm selecting all of the points that resemble the back except for these outer sides. And because in order to add this back amount of movement, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of eyeball this. So I'm going to drag these back out a little bit in that direction and then just deselect the outer side. So on a handful of the chair modeling videos from previous semesters, you'll see me doing something similar because most chairs have a little bit of rounding in the back. So if I view this from the top camera, we can see it's subtle, but it's there. There's a bit of rounding. I could make that more pronounced if I wanted to, but I think I'm okay with that for the time being. And we're going to want to do something similar with the seat bottom. So we'll probably want to add in a couple divisions, like so. Now we'll see that if I undo, or if I erase, just so that we can see these a little bit clearly, there's a little bit of a bump in the middle, sort of between where your two legs would be. So when I'm going to do something similar to that technique that I just did, but I'm going to leave this middle row actually alone. So we'll pull these down ever so slightly. So if we turn off our display mode, it's tough to see, but we can see just a little bit of something. And I might actually want to grab like those two kind of and nudge those ever so slightly, just because it seems like the bump up front is the most pronounced. So I can't deselect that because it's hiding, so I want to switch to my rectangle selection tool actually, and then hold Control to get rid of that point. I know it's kind of annoying, but just the way that the program works. Nudge that one back down ever so slightly. So I don't need to get too in depth. Obviously there are a handful more steps that we could take to make this a bit more accurate, but maybe the most obvious thing remaining is the fact that this seat is not paper thin, whereas right now it is paper thin in my Cinema 4D file. So what can we do to fix that? Well, there are a handful of options, but probably the most straightforward one is an object, and it's not going to be all that maybe expected, but it is called the cloth object, or sorry, the cloth surface. So if I make my cloth surface, and again, There's a hotkey that I should have held, but it's whatever. I want to make my cloth surface, and I want to make my seat object a child of that cloth surface, because it is important that the seat is underneath. Sorry, it's not underneath, it's within the cloth surface, as dictated by the little arrow there in the hierarchy. So with the cloth surface selected, there's a thickness value. And I don't know how thick to make this, but a value of like 2, that maybe might be a little bit thick, so let's try like 1.5. That gives us a bit of thickness. And now we can actually see that section where we put that little bit of rounding in. That's displaying quite nicely now. So I'm not sure if we want this to go in or out. I think actually that one looks a little bit better. Just by making that number negative, it reversed the direction that it was going. But anyway, that looks pretty good. And from this point, I think I actually want to leave that at 0. And we should be pretty good there. So I'm going to name this seat, or chair seat. So that's cool. And then now the 2 of these I can group. So group this and call this chair group. And I'm going to make sure that the chair seat is within that group. So I've got the full group of the chair, and this has both the seat and the legs within it. So like I said, we might need to scale this or adjust its proportions. We can go ahead and scale that down just a little bit. Rotate it around. And like I said, we can always revise the proportions of our desk, so let's just go ahead and do that. So I want to grab the desktop, the divider, this rear section thing, and pull all of these up, so that way there would be enough leg room between where your legs on the seat would be and the desk. And then on this desk leg, I can grab all those points now and lift those up to accommodate. So maybe this is a fancy sit and standing desk, or like a elevating desk, or something fancy. But that should be pretty good. So we can go ahead and real quickly get some materials going for this. So the black sort of plasticky looking material, we can probably duplicate the material that we used for the sides of the desk and put that onto the seat. Maybe make it a little bit darker, just so that they are differentiated from one another. And we can go and find a wood grain texture for the legs. Wood grain texture. So I'm sure I could reuse a wooden material that I already have, but I don't want to if I don't have to. Although I'm not seeing too many excellent options to match sort of the type of wood. So I think I'm going to take the wood grain that I used for this one down here, and I'm just going to adjust it. So that was the desk divider wood. So we're going to copy, paste that, and call this chair wood. And this is chair seat black. Okay. So this is the chair wood. Now we can, if we wanted to, we could open this up in Photoshop and maybe adjust the color or whatever, but we don't have to do all that. We can go ahead actually and use, just like in Photoshop, we can use an adjustment layer like hue and saturation or levels. We can do some of that built into Cinema 4D, and we can access the layers by, we don't want to click the texture itself, we want to click this little arrow next to it. And we are looking for the layer. So instead of it saying the name of the texture that we used to have, it now says layer, and that means that we can click into this and we see something that resembles kind of like a Photoshop layers palette, where we've got a handful of effects and we have things that we've layered in. So right now we only have one layer, and that is the texture that we had a second ago. And I can do an effect. I think I'm just going to do brightness, contrast, and gamma. I'm just going to raise the contrast of that a bit and lower the gamma, just so that I can add a little bit more richness into the color of this wood. And I might do just a little bit of hue so that I can make it ever so slightly less yellow, because this is not quite so yellow. Alright, so that should be cool. And we can apply that to the legs. We can apply that to all of the legs. Cool, so we applied it to the original one, and it is going to copy it to all of the instances, which is a nice time saver. And I'm just using the control button to copy and paste between all of these different sections. But we might realize that the wood grain doesn't look like it's going in the right direction. It's up to you on if this matters or not. But it's an easy fix. At least it should be an easy fix. So up to this point, we've been, if we have adjusted the settings of the material, we've been doing it from the tag setting. So we click on the tag and we have this tab called tag, but there's a coordinates tab. And I'm thinking, hopefully if we're lucky, all we have to do is rotate the image in one of the three axes and the grain will go kind of the long way instead of the short way. So if we get lucky, we might be able to, no, doesn't look like it. So we can try to rotate the texture. So if this works, no, okay. So that's cool. What if we change this to cubic? Sorry, sometimes this stuff happens when you're doing this stuff live. There we go, okay. So if it's not clear what happened, there we go, that looks better. Alright, so the grain is following at least closely to the direction of the wood, and I can rotate that a little bit more. Try to get that a little bit more spot on. That's looking pretty good. Alright, so to recap what I did, on this tag, there is a projection setting. We'll learn a whole lot more about this later, but up to this point we've been using it on the default setting, which was UVW. And so there are two of those weird letters coming back up, U and V. UV and W are, again, the up and down and left and right axes. That is the default setting, but we changed it to cubic. Again, we'll explain more in depth in another assignment what was going on, but in doing so, it allows us to use the texture mode. Just like how we can use object mode and point mode, etc., to manipulate the objects or the geometry of this, we can use the texture mode to manipulate the texture. So I just found the right direction to rotate that texture in, and now it's looking pretty good. So that should cover everything as far as the chair and the desk. We're hitting about the hour mark, so I'm going to wrap this up for today. We will probably finish up things on the next lesson, so that should be cool. We've got our chair, we've got some walls. We should be pretty good for today. So I will see you in the next one.